Assalamu alaikum. How are you all? I hope you are having a wonderful time. If you remember, in the previous class, my concentration was revolving around the aspect of animal communication system. In today's lecture, I would move towards the very important and significant discussion, and that is linguistics. Now, I have been concentrating and focusing on the aspect of language in general, but we did not carry out any analysis of this term linguistics, that what do we actually mean by this term linguistics, how it evolved over a period of time. So first, I'd like to explain this term, that what do we actually mean by this term. Linguistics in a common parlance refers to the study or the scientific study of language. When you look at this definition, the very opening words, the scientific study, clears the point. The scientific study means whatever you state, whatever theory you propose or propound, it should be based on logical reasoning. It must have a scientific justification, an empirical ground. In linguistics, as opposed to literature, you cannot say something or refer to something which cannot be proven experimentally or scientifically. For that matter, linguistics has always been very specific. It is just like mathematics, and there is a very wonderful saying, a very beautiful quotation in the language, that a good language teacher is a good mathematician. So this clarifies this ambiguity, that why linguistics is often different from literature, although both are interdependent, but one cannot expect that type of freedom that one can enjoy in literature. So this term linguistics is defined as the scientific study of language. Let's get into the etymological perspective of this term linguistics, that how this term evolved or how this term was introduced. So let's discuss it. This term linguistics is derived from a Latin word. I must qualify one thing, that English language owes, or it is indebted to other languages for its vocabulary and structure, specifically Latin language, because this language was considered to be the language of theology, scholarship, law, and academia. That was the reason that English was fed and supplemented by the Latin language, and most of the vocabulary, I would say, is taken and borrowed from Latin language and then Greek language. Other languages also contributed to English language, but Latin was the language which contributed greatly, to a greater extent, to English language. Now, Latin word. It's a Latin word, and this Latin word can be divided into two parts. The very first, lingua. The very second, istics. Now, what do we mean by lingua? Lingua means tongue. What do we actually mean by istics? Knowledge, science. Now, if you look at the term, if you look at the etymology, one can easily realize and identify that linguistics is actually the knowledge or the scientific knowledge of tongue. Tongue means language. So this term has been borrowed from Latin language. Now, why there appears to have been an interest, a very common interest in the area of language studies? Let's get into that background as well. It has been quite a fascinating journey on the part of Greek scholars. In the medieval period, the Greek scholars had realized that there should be a proper investigation into the aspect of language, and they introduced this inquiry that one must probe language as well, that how language functions, what is the function of language, what is the pattern of language, and what is the organization of language. With the passage of time, then there was a scholar, a linguist, P. Schlegel. He was the person, he was an individual who carried out, or I would say, who extended this probe and investigation and inquiry into the aspect of language. After P. Schlegel, other linguists by the name of Ferdinand de Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure is a very significant and famous name in the circle of linguists. He was a Swiss linguist. He came up with a model, and that model stands on two parameters. What are those parameters? Let's elaborate it. The very first one was lang. The second, parole. Now, what do we mean by these two terms? I would slightly qualify these terms. Now, if you can see on the whiteboard, I have written lang and then parole. Lang means language or knowledge of language. Lang exists in the mind. These two are very much important in the discussion of that model which was proposed by Ferdinand de Saussure. He said that every human has a lang in his mind, and then comes parole. Parole is the actual physical realization of a language. It means that we humans are possessing lang, the language capability, and when we speak, when we make a speech, when we talk, when we conversate, when we interact, we actually physically articulate that lang in the form of parole. This was the model proposed by Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, this model was quite famous, and it is synonymous with the model of Noam Chomsky, who came up with the aspect of competence and performance. Competence and performance and lang and parole, they are actually an offshoot of each other. Now let's discuss what is language, how it functions, and why linguistics is important. What are those important factors? Now, the idea is to explain that what is linguistics, how linguistics operate. The very first thing, Linguistics over a period of time evolved as a different separate entity. There are numerous researchers that are carrying out researches as a specialization, as part of their specialization. There is a great body of knowledge and literature available in the library, on the internet, and linguistics has now become a separate department. Previously, there was no such concept that linguistics would be discussed, although there were some interest in the analysis and investigation of language, but linguistics did not become a separate body of literature from literature in specific. That is the reason that we call linguistics as a completely different subject. Number two, linguistics as a science. Now, why literature is put into the category of arts and linguistics in the category of science? There are reasons. In literature, one can come up with anything, one can express something which is not humanly possible. But in linguistics, when you refer to a theory or when you state a theory, you need to justify that theory through hypotheses, experimentation, observation, and all those observations and experimentations need to come up with a substantial logic or argument. That's the reason linguistics operates and functions differently, because its overall organization is completely different from literature. That is the reason why linguistics has been classified as a body of science, not arts. Now, when the third factor is looked at, the astounding factor strikes the mind, and that is that if you call linguistics a pure science, how can it become a social science? So, just to give you a reminder, we call linguistics the scientific study of language, and language is very much social. Language is a social phenomenon. It is spoken, understood, used by a society, by a community, or more specifically, a speech community. So it is the society which speaks a language. So that is the reason why we call it a social science, because the phenomenon that we are probing itself is quite social. That's the reason it has also been referred to as a social science. So these are the three parameters which can easily highlight the factors, the functions, and the overall utility or significance of language and linguistics as a subject. Now, this was the discussion or a brief background about linguistics. In the next session, we'll see each other. I would like you all to keep yourself updated. Do subscribe my channel and watch my videos. Thank you very much for your time. Allah Hafiz.